Are the stars out tonight?
All right, everybody. Well, we got Josh Daws in the house today. Super excited to just get to chat with this guy. I've seen him from afar on Twitter. He's, it's when you see a reasonable, biblically informed person on Twitter, it's like a voice crying out in the desert, and so they tend to stand out. And he's one of those guys. So speaking into a lot of the stuff we've been talking about lately, and I think he brings a lot of wisdom and depth and experience and just, clear thinking into some of these issues that are getting muddied and difficult to wade through right now. So let me bring Josh in real quick. Thanks for coming on the podcast, Josh.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Seth.
Yeah, man. So I just want to jump right in with you. There's been a couple things that have been stirring up the Twitter fires lately. We talked a little bit about one of them last week on here with one of Stephen Wolf's tweets, and just all the back and forth with Christian nationalism and racism and all that kind of stuff. But one of the factors that's been kind of emerging this week as well is the topic of cultural Christianity. And I remember being maybe in my late teens, early 20s, and saying things like, you look back on yourself sometimes and you cringe. I'll probably look back on this moment and cringe. But I remember saying just kind of naively, man, I hate cultural Christianity. It's just, it's blah, blah, blah. And you kind of say those things and you don't realize what it would really be like without some of those cultural norms being informed by Christianity. You just kind of see the hypocrisy and the stuff like that, and you throw it all. But lately I've been seeing that among people that I think should know better. They're older. They have many of them. They understand church history. They have theological degrees. But there's a conversation going on right now in the Twitter world on whether or not cultural Christianity is good or bad. And I think some of it's been silly to me, to be honest, to see some of the people's thoughts and responses on that. But could you just tell us a little bit about that? Like, what is that controversy, and how would you weigh in on that subject?
Sure, yeah. I think it like you said, I think it's really kind of stemming from Christian nationalism and that discussion. I think it's kind of as, different, I don't know, tribes, I guess, different, people that see things differently are trying to figure out, what do we do with this Christian nationalism thing? Because it seems to be becoming a thing. And so I think as that kind of topic starts to get unpacked, we're seeing kind of like these miniature little squabbles over like different elements of that. And I think that the latest one is this idea of cultural Christianity and whether or not that's actually a good thing. Does that hinder the gospel? Does that help the gospel? So a lot of that's being hashed out with, the kind of Christian nationalist side. I myself, I understand Neil Shinvey's hesitation with that term. So I'm not, I don't think I'm quite ready to say I'm a Christian nationalist. But my sympathies are definitely in that camp. I think that Christians largely have kind of lost the will to exert political power on behalf of our neighbors and a society informed by Christian values. I think we've bought into a lot of the kind of secular, liberal, kind of a neutral political space, thinking that it's possible we can just kind of live and let live, and we won't exert our will if the other side agrees to not exert their will. And it's just, we're reaching a point where it's becoming clear that that's not really tenable. That there's always going to be a moral framework behind it. And so, a lot of, as this stuff is being unpacked, I think, the kind of Christian nationalist side is kind of rethinking a lot of those assumptions, like you mentioned, of cultural Christianity. And just thinking, no, that actually is a lot better than what we've got now, where we seem to be headed, a culture that, is spreading, trans ideology and just the culture of death with abortion. And it's just, a culture where, Christian music plays in the stores you shop at. And, there are Bible verses, on the, like in and out on the, the soda cup, that's better than the pride flags everywhere. And so I think there's a lot of rethinking that. And then on the side that is kind of anti Christian nationalists is, I think, looking at it from the point of view that cultural Christianity makes it more difficult to spread the gospel. That if you have a bunch of people who think they're Christians already, then it is, it's hard to reach them because they don't think they need anything. They don't recognize, and so I think the idea is that, if you're dealing with like pagans, then you have some place to, lead them to, instead of like trying to convince someone that they're not what they think they are. And that's kind of where I see the lay of the land right now.
Yeah, that's helpful. So I think you're saying, in essence, the cultural Christianity discussion right now is kind of a sub point to this larger debate on theology in the state and all that kind of stuff. But it has been interesting because you do think, I think the part of that impulse I had as a young person, when you watch a movie, sometimes, and they love, to do this in movies anyways, but one of the worst characters is always the one who's the religious person who's the most hypocritical. Mm-hmm. And I think people have like had those experiences in some of the cultural Christianity elements, and that's where they're like, man, that's the worst kind of gross thing that you can think of. But I think what you're saying is like, when you think of culture at a deeper level, like religion externalized, as it's sometimes defined, mm-hmm. I think that people don't know. I don't know. It just seems like a surface analysis to say, I don't like the hypocrisy that sometimes comes with it and that kind of gross element, without realizing, man, like, what would it have really been like to live in ancient Aztec culture, with sacrifices and sure. tribal war and stuff like that. And we don't take into account the kind of norms that are set up by the creational norms we find in Genesis and Old Testament law and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. One of my friends...
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, one of my friends this week said that criticizing cultural Christianity is a luxury belief. It's like one of those things that we're in it. We've experienced the blessings of it. It's kind of easy to, kind of nitpick and, find faults with it. But the alternative is pretty dark. And, we're fortunate to have grown up in that space. Right. But I was like you. For the longest time, I'm a pastor's kid. So I've seen, I grew up with tons of people in churches, and that frustration pastors have. You want to see your people growing. You want to see them on fire for Jesus and, wanting to share their faith. And they just seem, a lot of people seem content to just show up and think that attending church makes them a Christian. And so there's this desire like to live, to have an authentic, strong community of believers who are all, solidly, on fire for Jesus. And we look at our churches sometimes and think, these, nominal Christians are just ruining everything. And, one thing, in the kind of discussion as this is unfolded, I was reading in Matthew and came across, was reminded of the parable of the weeds, where the wheat starts coming up and the enemy comes in and sows a bunch of weeds in with the wheat. And the workers go to the master and like, hey, do you want us to get this out, to pluck up the weeds? And he tells them like, no, leave it at harvest. I'll sort them. It's just don't worry about that right now. At harvest, it'll all sort itself out. And so I think a lot of times in that desire to have, a pure church that is, it's just true believers, we can become overzealous. And, really, I think a lot of the critiques of cultural Christianity can sometimes veer into like kind of rooting on the cultural decline to help purify our churches, which is kind of a weird place for Christians to be.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I think we assume, man, the worse things get, the better for the church, and it is often the case, that persecution, becomes the seedbed of church growth. But I don't know if you said this the other day, Josh, or somebody was saying, but the church also grew even greatly under Constantine. It wasn't only under when the Romans were persecuting the church, and you also have, you have areas like China where it is growing. Although I think sometimes, from what I've heard from Oz Guinness, who grew up, I think, as a missionary kid in China, he said sometimes we idealize that, and things are a lot rougher there than we think. But even with, I think I remember him saying once that there were many people that he was familiar with over there that were one unanswered prayer away from falling from the faith. And like there was a lot going on in that church because I think sometimes we just over idealize, like, man, if that happened here, it would be the greatest thing. But you look at North Korea, and it's like, man, that's another example of how persecution there, I think, has really made it difficult for the church to get off the ground. And I don't think we should be so maybe Pollyannish about that idea.
Yeah. Paul, in one of the letters to, I think, Thessalonians, to the Thessalonians or Timothy, tells them to pray, and to make it your ambition to live a quiet life. Where the implication where you can, go about a normal life and share the faith, and the gospel will spread that way. And I think a lot of people look at that and like, see, there you go. Don't get involved in politics. Right. Well, the state brings order to society so that you can live, that type of life. So right. I think, we're kind of looking at that backwards, and it's kind of, God has given the state a role, the government a role to, maintain order and to restrict evil and to promote the good. I think that's really at the core of what, the Christian nationalist side wants from state. We want, the state to be performing its God-given roles according to a Christian moral framework and not a pagan one.
Right. And I think that's an important distinction, like you said, a Christian, a pagan one, because I do think our default in America is to think if you just got rid of the cultural Christianity, that we'd have this kind of nice, everybody kind of gets natural law, and we sort of would all agree on the big things, but then we could just within that have good evangelism. But I don't think we understand that, like, Christ or chaos thing. And that's the part that can be frustrating, because you're like, man, if you don't understand that by now with the free fall that we are in culturally, like, you may never get it, because now it's like, I think we should be waking up to the idea that the things we've taken for granted that we think would still be there if we just got rid of cultural Christianity, it wouldn't even. It would be. It's like a dystopian novel, basically. And I don't know if you saw this tweet today, but another voice I've been listening to lately, it's been helpful through some of these things, is John Harris over at Conversations That Matter. But I think Megan Basham posted this on Twitter earlier, and this was John. I guess his tweet went viral on Facebook. And
I saw that. Yeah.
You saw that? Okay. Yeah. He's saying some people have asked for a positive example of cultural Christianity. And he says, okay, here you go. I'm sitting in a coffee shop right now in Tennessee playing I'll Fly Away with Bible verses on the walls. Crosses are on display instead of pride flags. People are friendly. I didn't walk in expecting everyone to be born again. I didn't walk in thinking they must all be hypocrites deceived into thinking they're Christians. How terrible. I live in New York, where the coffee shops play raunchy music. People aren't as friendly and decor is sexualized. This is a breath of fresh air. And I've actually experienced that before too, because my wife and I have done a lot of traveling, and we used to kind of be like, man, I would love to live over here overseas and there. And then, all the stuff happened with COVID, and we saw what happened to people that actually lived there. And we're like, man, I'm thankful that we still have a constitution that somewhat functions. But I do remember being in Paris and just feeling the kind of post-Christian culture weighing on me after a while. And we were on a subway train, and I heard like this group of like young people singing a Christian song, and it was like, oh man, it was such a relief in that moment.
Mhm.
And for the first time, I began to kind of be aware of what John's saying. We moved to California, kind of same thing. It was like, oh man, there's a lot I took for granted that
Mhm.
now I'm thankful for. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. We lived in Burbank, California for 7.5 years. Moved from Georgia, same sort of culture shock.
Right.
Went from kind of remnants of still cultural Christianity and the Bible Belt to like a place where you know it, you don't go to church. You just
Yeah.
don't. There's no cultural pressure to have your family in church. And I admit at the time it was like, oh, this is nice. That means that the people I'm going to be going to church with they really take it seriously. It's the real deal.
Yeah.
Well, over time, we saw many of those people we went to church with follow the kind of social justice path to deconstruction. So it's like,
Yep.
wait a minute, it doesn't necessarily purify the church. It doesn't mean there's not nominal Christians in a more pagan culture, and I think that's what I'm not sure your views on soteriology. I'm of the Reformed um, bent, and so I believe God is sovereign in salvation, and
Yeah.
so it is His job to save people. He has His
Yeah.
elect from the beginning of time, and so if it's true, Jesus says in John 6, I think 37, that all that the Father gives me will come to me, and all that come to me will be saved. Okay, so if we can rest on that, knowing that God is going to save His people, then the question doesn't become which culture is it easiest to evangelize in, or which culture is,
Yeah.
are people more likely to come, to saving faith. Well, it doesn't matter. God's going to save people in China. God's going to save His people in Russia. He's going to save them in the Bible Belt. He's going to save them whatever culture you find yourself in. Our job is to preach the gospel. So
Yeah.
at that point, if we can rest in the sovereignty of God, at the, we at that point we start asking, well, what's the best society for our neighbors? What is the best society, best culture that will um, you know produce the most good for our
Yeah.
neighbors?
If you want to grow in your confidence in knowing what you believe and why you believe it, if you want to ground your faith in biblical Christianity and step into who God has called you to be, I want to tell you about a great program put on by Impact 360, and it's called Propel. Propel is a one-week transformational leadership and discipleship experience where high school students gather together to be grounded in a biblical worldview as they learn how to follow Jesus, have a godly influence, learn how to disciple their peers, and boldly live out their faith in their daily lives. So they're having 2 sessions this summer. The first one is June 19th through the 25th, and the second one is June 26th through July 2nd. These programs fill up really quickly, and I promise you will not be disappointed. So we'll put the link below if you're interested in looking into it, and we'll see you this summer.
No, that's an important point too, and I think like, interestingly enough, so I probably lean toward the chastened Molinist side, kind of Arminian, but I say chastened because I think I used to have a higher view of our ability to reason with people and then come to see the truth. And again, then COVID happened and 2020 happened. And I'm like, man, people, there's a lot more going on to people's beliefs than just being able to have a rational discussion and love them into the kingdom even, and all this kind of stuff. I do think, it's interesting as most of the guys that I listen to these days have been Reformed guys, and to hear them talk about that and the means of grace and how God does use, even for them, I think it was Andrew Sandlin I was listening to the other day, and how, he says typically for him as a Calvinist, God's election runs through families that are saved, and how cultural Christianity is a means that God will often use to bring about salvation. So, from that perspective, that's definitely an interesting conversation. But I think you're right. I think that to get caught up in that, that whole thing to that degree, I think would end up putting you in kind of an unbiblical place, no matter which perspective you come from on that. And I kind of land where you're saying about that is like, man, no, we what are we called to do ultimately as the church? I think we're called to be salt and light, and we're called to occupy till he comes. It's not just, snatch a few brands from the fire, or polish the brass on a sinking ship, and that's the best we can do, or whatever it might be. So I think that, I'm right with you on that. And I think that one of the things that's been interesting to me to think about, I wonder what your thoughts are on this, but the cultural Christianity actually can, be a place where by and large more people do actually come to saving faith. Like, I think you could argue that in the sense that, you have Christian families that, you have people that walk away from that, but that does tend to be a better indicator of people that you do see actually come to what appears to be genuine faith more than people that come from families that don't. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, actually, my wife is not terribly active on Twitter, but she's kind of like my sounding board. We get up early and we have these great conversations before the kids get up. And we were talking about cultural Christianity, I guess a couple weeks ago now. And she was, I kind of, think about it, at the conceptual level up here. And she's really good at kind of taking these ideas and applying it to life. And it dawned on her that, like, my life is a product of cultural Christianity. Her parents had to get married. It was an unplanned pregnancy. And because of that pressure, that cultural pressure, they got married instead of having an abortion. And because of that cultural pressure, they took her to church where she heard the gospel and where she, attended Awana and learned a lot, of Bible verses, memorized Bible verses, all the while her family, her parents were kind of spiraling into dysfunction. And so the church really became like a haven. And that's where she was saved and also saw examples of the way families should be. And so because of cultural Christianity, she ends up in a church, where she's saved, and God kind of gives her this vision for changing her family tree. And so that's been really cool to see. So she wrote a thread about that on Twitter, and a lot of people really resonated with that. It got, a lot of views and shares. And I think that's just, and so many people responded to that and like, yes, this is my story. Thank you for articulating this. And I think that God uses that, even with those, nominal people in our churches that we're frustrated with. Well, their kids are there, you have them there, preach the gospel. It baffles me that we would complain about, and I did this all the time, complain about the people that just show up on Christmas and Easter. They're going to hear the gospel twice a year. Why are we upset about this?
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, man. No, I think you're right. And a lot of this stuff is sort of putting it in perspective for us, which is, again, mind-boggling while it's not doing that for others. But, I think that's part of it for sure is maybe it actually does have a positive effect on even if you're thinking like the only goal is to, rescue souls for heaven. I think you could make a good argument that cultural Christianity is a better way to do that than cultural paganism. But you also mentioned this, that like, man, for love of neighbor, like, do we actually think that God created the world and that he created it to function in a certain way, that when we function according to that plan, that it actually brings more blessing than harm? And is that a good thing? Like, I think that's another part that I don't know that we've either thought through or that we agree with that as Christians, that God's ways are actually good even for an unbeliever. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned Christian families. We order, when we have kids, they don't come to us saved, I don't want to get into infant baptism discussion, but they don't come to us saved. But we order our homes in such a way that they learn what God, expects. They learn God's law. They learn how to behave, with the hopes that presentation of the gospel, that living their life in the patterns of a Christian, God will use that as the means. And to me, it's like a lot of the arguments against the Christian nationalism, I don't understand why that doesn't apply to larger groups. Like, if that's how we order our homes, well, why couldn't we order our communities that way, so that we're still promoting those same morals, and God's law is instructive. It it can be a teacher. And so, yeah, that's one of the things that kind of frustrates me in this discussion, that we don't seem to kind of recognize the translation from Christian family to Christian community. Like, why can't we do that? Because we have a category for Christian schools, and that doesn't imply that everyone in the school is a believer. And that's one of the critiques you hear often, is like, well, we can't have a Christian nation because that would imply that everybody in the nation is a Christian. Well, then we better stop having Christian schools if we're going to use that logic, because if you've ever worked in a Christian school or attended a Christian school, everyone in that school is not a Christian. But we still, it's not about a label applied to everyone in the school. It's saying this is how this school is going to operate. This school operates from a biblical worldview according to a Christian moral framework. I think we just need to apply that to government and to politics and to culture. That's the thing too, that so much of this can get lost in, like, what does the state do? Well, there's a lot of ways to have bring about a Christian culture that don't require the state to act. Christians used to be known for the art we made, and the literature, and there's ways to influence culture far beyond just the state. And so I think we need to have a comprehensive view of how we can shape the world that God's placed us in.
No, that's good. I think that's right on. And you often hear, like, we catch them first, then we clean them. So if we don't want to do anything that gets in the way of catching them, so to speak. And so, but I think your analogies with Christian school and a Christian family, it's like, if you took that with your kids, you would never train them according to good standards. You'd say, no, I'm just going to wait till they get saved, and then. But we know that's crazy. But it does throw us into often fighting with culture, and that sometimes can feel counterproductive. How do you? I don't even know if I have a question for this formulated all the way, but knowing that it's going to upset people and maybe get in the way of presenting to them at least the American version of Jesus, where he'll fix your life and make everything better. But how do you in general recommend, like, we approach some of these issues, like the transgenderism thing and the homosexuality issue and all that kind of stuff as it stands?
Yeah. I think we can tend to overemphasize evangelism to the exclusion of some other concerns. The example I've given before is, we can become so concerned with reaching the homosexual community that we kind of turn a blind eye to a lot of the kids that are being targeted by that agenda. And I think we have to be able to defend the defenseless, the most vulnerable, while at the same time, opposing the agenda that's targeting them. and kind of we need a lot of discernment to, figure out the difference between, a trans influencer who is, really leading a lot of people astray, and a confused, trans person who shows up at your church. You're going to have a different response to each one. And so this is such a different time. It's really unprecedented, in our lifetimes, at least. I know we can go back throughout history and find plenty of dark times. But in our lifetimes, this is unprecedented. And I think we're just going to have a ton of discernment to see, when do we need to be opposing wickedness, and how do we make our evangelism fit within that? Because I don't think it's a either or. It's got to be a both. Yeah.
No, you're right on with that. And I've quoted Michael Brown a few times on that, where he said, resist the agenda and reach out to the victims of the agenda. Sometimes those victims are adults, sometimes they're kids, but man, that's tough. So, and we're kind of moving there naturally, but this connects to the Christian nationalist debate and use of power. We have to use kind of every means we have in this battle against darkness. We're trying to rescue individuals. We're trying to push back on the darkness, trying to impact the culture, but also we want our laws to reflect good morality, right, at the end of the day. And I think most would agree with that, but I think you still have this kind of anti-Christian nationalist push and this fear of power. And some on the surface, it can seem persuasive, because you look at the ministry of Jesus and the disciples and you're like, man, they, it's easy to make a case from that they were, resisting power, right? And or at least political power. Mm-hmm. And then I saw a tweet today, I'm sure you saw this, but one of the anti kind of Christian nationalist guys right now on Twitter in this debate was comparing it to the Ring of Sauron, the Ring of Power in Lord of the Rings, and saying, basically, Boromir wanted to use the ring. He was like, we'll use the ring for good. And, Gandalf was like, they all understood, no, this ring can't be wielded for good. You have to destroy it. In other words, kind of like you have to get rid of this will to power, that you can't use the left's game, quote unquote, will to power. We have to die to power and let Christ rule when he comes back and returns, as I think roughly the idea. Did you have any thoughts on that? I don't know if I'm sure you've heard that general idea before, but how do you approach that topic of, as Christians, should we exert power in the political sphere?
Yeah, I've seen that metaphor quite a bit. It's not a great metaphor, because the Ring of Power was made by Sauron, so it was made by the enemy, and so trying to use the enemy's weapon to achieve good ends is not the Christian way. But the state is a gift from God. God ordained the state to, and gave it, very clear charge. You see this in Romans 13, to restrain evil and to promote the good. Yeah. And so to just completely, take our hands off the state, I think it's foolish to kind of abandon a good gift and just abandon it to the enemy. Like, we're going to let them use it because we don't want to sully our hands with exerting power. I had a thought there, but
as you're thinking about that, for when you said that, this just popped into my head. But I honestly think that analogy could potentially even work better at a kind of a small level for the church growth movement. Because, and you see this in the example, I can't remember the pastor's name, Michael Todd or something like that. They did that recent Easter service, but part of the pushback on what he did, in a sense, was using sensuality in one of the particular skits, almost to emphasize that, like, and there was a pastor, he was wanting to grow weed. I think it was in your neck of the woods in Atlanta, and teach young men, how to grow this thing. And he thought that's a great way to reach, do outreach. And there's all kind of funny examples, and there's more serious examples, but those are cases where we've in church tried to use carnality to do a kind of a bait and switch, and we'll reach them with this, and then we'll get them plugged into the Spirit, and he'll clean them up, kind of deal. So I would say that you're right on with that. And interestingly enough, I think Joel Webbin made that same point today. He said, what if the ring was being used by Sauron, but it was made by God? He said secularism did not make the state, God made it. It can never be unmade in this age. It can only be used. Christian nationalists merely want to use it rightly. And I think, in essence, that's the same thing you're saying is like, no. It's those hierarchies that God built. God built the state. Like, that's his invention. What we want to do is put it toward its right telos. It's right, use it how it's designed. So I think that's an important point to be made, but I do think a lot of Christians are like tentative with that. It's like, man, like to how could I impose my beliefs on others is often the thought.
Yeah, and I think we've bought into a lot of the classical liberalism, a lot of the ideas there that everyone should be completely free to make all the decisions. As long as you're doing no harm, then it should be legal. It should be free. It should be, do whatever makes you happy. And, I think, first of all, that's that's more of kind of a post-war liberal understanding. If you go back to our founding, John Locke himself, was in favor of outlawing atheism. So, really, you go back to our founders, they start looking a lot more Christian nationalists than a lot of our Christian brothers are comfortable with right now. And so, I think there so much of this conversation is kind of having to adjust to this new negative world we're in and kind of rethink a lot of the assumptions that we've been operating under for our whole lives. And that's, I think we've got to have a lot of patience. People, no one had even heard the term Christian nationalism. It wasn't widely used before, 2-3 years ago. So at this point, let's have a lot of grace on each other. Let's be patient. Let's try and explain what we mean. Let's use clarity in our speech. I think most of this division is, good, faithful brothers that I've benefited from a ton in the past, and I expect to, going on. And so, I just hope we can kind of get, kind of tap the brakes on some of the, nastiness on Twitter and really hear each other out, not try and knock down straw man arguments, and let's, actually, deal with the substance.
For sure. Yeah. Cause I'm seeing a lot of that, more straw man than anything really in this, I'm just lurking and watching. I haven't entered the fray cause it's quite a fray. But as I'm watching, I'm like, man, it's just, but I think you're spot on with having to rethink. Cause I've been in many conversations with, just kind of your average folks on the road, traveling, doing music. And they're like, well, you can't legislate morality. They were saying that like 15 years ago. And even back then I was like, well, you can only legislate morality. Like it's a moral framework, but I hadn't even thought about it that deeply. I think in the past 5 years, people are starting to make those connections like, oh, all legislation is a moral framework, and all moral framework is grounded in a kind of theology, even if it's an atheology. And if it's an atheology, that sort of creates a vacuum for other pagan theologies to come in and eventually take over. And so that's why we can't just kind of withdraw from that space. There has to be a positive vision for the state. And I think this is one of the ideas that that I've seen in the back and forth, but I think one of the things that's helped me is to remember the Great Commission, when Jesus started off with, all authority on heaven and earth has been given to me, therefore go, baptizing the nations and teaching them to do all that I have commanded. I think that phrase often gets left out. Mm-hmm. And all that he's commanded includes a lot of things that God has said about the nature of persons, how grace, restores nature, all this types of things. So I do agree with you that I hope that cooler heads prevail, and I hope that these guys that are kind of creating these strawman versions of it come to see that there's a lot more to this thing than what they might have initially thought, and that we do need to have a unified kind of push, at least in a general direction, together. One of the things that you mentioned earlier, and that we both had Neil on the show talking about, is this kind of like unseemly side in the tent of Christian nationalism with racism. You've probably been in this stream, like studying this longer than I have. What is your take on that whole subject? Do you think that there's a large part of under that tent that we should be scared of? Because I think even people that I've been bringing this discussion to in our podcast, they're like, yeah, I'm a little bit nervous about some of those folks. And so they're hesitant to want to even step in under that tent as well. What's your thoughts on that?
So I think you have to understand a lot of what's happening on the right. As I've talked about those presuppositions. I think a lot of people, not just Christians, are re-examining a lot of their priors. They are questioning liberalism. There's a lot of books that have been written on, out of that kind of post-liberal thought. Patrick Deneen's book, Why Liberalism Failed. Rusty Reno's Return of the Strong Gods, Christopher Caldwell's Age of Entitlement. A lot of these ideas a lot of these books are really taking aim at a lot of those kind of post-war liberal consensus kind of America since the 60s. A lot of the ideology, the kind of neutral framework, and I think so. As people are questioning those things, some people are getting carried away and questioning things. Whereas Christians, we have, God's word as guardrails to, evaluate ideas against. There is an element on the right that is, delving in some darker ideology, and I don't think it is. I don't think we need to completely ignore it, but I also don't think that it's as widespread as some would have you believe. I think, it definitely needs to be condemned. Like, guys like Andrew Tate, who are just like way out there, awful. No Christian needs to be following that guy. But yeah, I think there's a lot of kind of nut picking as well to try and, tarnish, good brothers that are just thinking differently about politics. They're having different, political, they're exploring political theology and what it means, to be, what does ethnicity mean in Scripture, and it makes a lot of people uncomfortable to talk about that stuff. And I fully grant that there are people that have talked about it in really foolish ways, that knowing how it sounds to most, modern Christians with the upbringing we've had, I think there's a lot of, kind of foolish approaches to some of these topics that are counterproductive. But yeah, I don't know. That's kind of where I'm at on it.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I think that's kind of like the impression I get, what you're saying there, for sure. Do you think, are you hopeful in this next little bit? Do you get the sense that um, there's going to be sort of like a rapprochement between these warring tribes that have ended on the right, like we've ended up together on the fault line between, being woke and not woke, but now the not woke side is sort of having an intramural, maybe more than a squabble. Do you see this going in the positive direction, or how are you feeling about that?
I'm hopeful that the net result of all this will be a more clearly articulated understanding of what it is that we'd like to see in the political realm or the cultural realm. Um, yeah, because I think largely we all want this. We'd love to see the same things. I don't think anybody on the other side is cheering on drag queen story hour. Um, that's not who we're dealing with here. And so I think if we can kind of, I don't know, better articulate it, hopefully we'll kind of reach some sort of like minimal viable product that everybody can kind of get behind. And then if there's because some of the Christian nationalist conversation is very theoretical. If we're asking the question, are revolutions ever justified? Well, that's a conversation worth having. Let's look at the Bible and see what God's word says about that. But that's not a reality that is anything that is within the realm of possibility for
Right.
2023 America.
Right.
So worrying about installing a Protestant pope or a Christian prince after a bloody revolution,
Right.
that's kind of an academic
Sure.
debate.
And I was going to ask you about those academic debates, like, because you also have like everybody's kind of sort of up in arms about enforcing the first table of the law, for instance. And that's another one I think you could probably put more in the theoretical debate side. That's not coming for a while. But how do you, where are those conversations worth having? And if so, where do you place them in all this?
Yeah, I think they're worth having. I don't know that they're the hills to die on. Because my big concern is there's very real momentum in the country right now. Kind of a backlash against, especially the trans ideology. I think
Right.
we still got some persuasion to do on pro-life, anti-abortion stuff, but certainly people are getting fed up with a lot of the woke stuff. And you see guys like Chris Rufo and a lot of what DeSantis is doing really pushing back against that. I would hate for Christians not to be there on the front lines of those battles in those rooms where these policies are being hashed out, because we're debating whether or not a Christian prince is a good idea or not. It's like, okay, let's table that and focus on some real wins that we can get right now.
Yeah. So we can be involved in kind of sketching it out in the back room, but like when we come on stage together, we we need to put on the game face and get to it. So, kind of last question here, but what do you if you got to step up on that stage and kind of charge just the church right now, the American church, in regard to this area of stepping into recovering what we've kind of like just neglected and handed over really to the enemy in the form of culture and in the form of civic engagement, what would you say?
Yeah, I would encourage the church that it's not bad. You're not bad to lament what we've lost. A lot of Christians, some Christian leaders will kind of, celebrate the decline of cultural Christianity. They'll kind of, if you're concerned about culture, they'll call you a culture warrior, and you're just afraid. You just don't want to be uncomfortable. And Jesus said we're going to suffer. You know, I, I don't think those voices are helpful. I don't think that's true. I think it is, you know, it's we are supposed to look out for our kids. You know, our kids are going to be growing up in this culture. It's not bad to want to hand them a culture that's better than, you know, what we have now. So we don't need to apologize for that. We need to really rediscover the will um, to influence culture. We don't need to assume the defensive, assume the, you know, minority position just because things seem dark. You know, let's be bold. Let's tell people what we think. It gets easy to get sucked into these kind of spirals of silence where we stay quiet, we don't say what we think. You know, we're trying to, you know, protect our witness so we don't venture into anything controversial. But if we have confidence that God is sovereign, he's, you know, he's going before us, he's preparing the way, you know, he is the one that ultimately saves souls, we can go out with boldness and really try and, you know, just in the tiny sphere of influence that you have, you can begin to recover some of what we've lost just by being bold about your faith again, or, you know, sharing your opinion when difficult, you know, conversations come up. You know, and maybe some of you called to run for, you know, city council. And when they propose, you know, we're going to celebrate Pride Month, stand up and say, no, we're not. You know, this is a Christian community. We're not going to do that here. And fight for, you know, those things. Don't just like assume, you know, oh, we got to let them have this. We got to take this, you know, submissive posture. No, we don't. You know, let's start to, you know, become comfortable exerting, you know, that will for the good of our neighbors.
No, that's really good, man. I agree 100% with that charge. And if I had to choose between, you know, a Calvinist culture shaking and the evangelifish squishy Arminian, you can hand me the tulip and point me in the right direction. But no, I appreciate that perspective so much, man. I think we have to get on board right now and do exactly that. And I, you know, I'm saying that to myself because I've been trained in that. I'm like, that's ingrained in me is like, man, don't be controversial. Like, don't say anything that's going to push people away. And so I'm not just telling that to our listeners, but I'm saying that to myself as well. Like we have to be able to go out there and stand flat-footed and, you know, really proclaim the whole counsel of God and let the chips fall where they fall.
And what you'll find is that there are more people that grew up in the Christian culture that were not Christians, but they see what we've lost. And I think we have this picture in our mind that everybody that's not a Christian is a radical leftist and they love all of this. That's not the case.
Yep.
You know, I think the more we can be bold, we can fight these ideologies, we're going to have more opportunities to share the gospel. It's just, they're going to see, you know, what makes us different. Why are you willing to risk cancellation? Why are you willing to risk you know, all, you know, the cultural cost of, you know, standing up against this stuff, and it'll be because it's the right thing to do. And I'm a Christian and this is what God has called us to do. And this is how we love our neighbors. Let me tell you about the gospel. You know, there's so many opportunities right now. And I think, you know, the church just needs to stand up and begin seizing them.
I think that's dead on. I think that's dead on. And, you know, again, another mindset that I have to fight, but we think the more soft and effeminate and kind of just this, we are, you know, will draw the people. But I think people are looking for people that are sacrificed, that'll stand in the gap. And that's why they're running to, you know, like you said, the Tate and, you know, Joe Rogan and all these guys, as they're seeing that to a degree. And so I think as Christians, we're, you know, really missing a real opportunity to step in that place and be who really God called us to be. So.
Yep.
Well, thank you, man. Thanks for spending this time with us. And best way that people can connect with your ministry?
Yeah, sure. I'm on Twitter at Josh Daws, Daws. And then I host the Great Awakening podcast. You can find that on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Yep, and I've recommended that podcast before. It's great, and I definitely, if you're brave enough to get on Twitter, he's definitely a good guy to follow on there. So do it. Well, thanks, Josh, and yeah, man, blessings on your ministry and continued endeavors, and hopefully we'll get to talk again in the future.
Thanks, Seth.
I have